share my screen. Let's get that. Okay, so here we are with another session of automating yourself with Google Apps Script. And so today what I wanted to do was nothing too in-depth, but just introduce how web apps work in Google Apps Script. So as there were a small group this time, feel free to ask lots of questions and whatever. Okay, so what our goal is today, I think, Omar, you may already know most of this, but you'll see a little bit that might help you understand the APIs. But for the rest, I'm just going to give a quick introduction to HTTP and HTML. I could go a lot deeper into those, or the HTML kind of part in later lessons. We'll see how it goes, see what makes sense for people. Then we're going to understand this do-get method and look at some HTML templates, how that works in Google Apps Script. Okay, so very first thing, understanding. Actually, wait a second. Let me just do one thing. I'm going to reshare. Maybe I just reshare everything. That's going to be easiest, so that I can see two windows at the same time. Okay, we'll put on screen 2. Okay, can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So a very basic. Oh, we got someone new just joined. Martina again. That's funny. Okay. Okay. So the very basics of how HTTP and HTML work. So what is HTTP? First of all, it stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and it's the network protocol that is exchanged between a web server and your laptop or a phone when you access a web page. And this has been around for a long time. Hi, Lucas. We've just started.
Hello.
Hello. Just to recap, so today we're doing an intro into web applications. Nothing too intense today, but we're going to show you how that works, basically. So I was just starting with some fundamental explanation of HTTP and HTML. So HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's the network protocol that a web server and like your laptop or phone exchange when you're getting stuff from a website. But HTTP, what it does is it carries the content to your browser, and that could be HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, or it could be images or videos or other types of files. And all of these sit on top of HTTP. So HTTP, you can think of it like it's a truck and it's carrying this content to your laptop. I could say a whole lot more about these, but I'm trying to give you the minimum viable introduction. Okay, now, one key thing here, the reason why I mention HTTP is because it has these things called methods. And the two you need to be a little bit aware of, especially get when you're using Google Apps Script, is that when your laptop pulls a web page from a web server, it uses something called a get method. The name makes sense. You want to get something. So that's how you read a web page from a web server or get an image or anything like that. That's always using an HTTP get method. Another method, there are a few more, but the two most important ones are get and post. Another one is post, and that's for when you want to send data to a server, like when a form is submitted. This is, and this would be normally like a kind of read versus write. Now, when it comes to Google Apps Script, you actually don't usually use post. There are other things, and we'll look at that in later lessons. But the reason why I mention that, maybe if I just jump forward, is because you have this special function called do-get, which is what you need to have in your script to be able to respond to a get request. Okay, and we'll give an example of that in a minute. The other thing is, so what we're sending over HTTP, if it's HTML, this is what HTML looks like. Now, HTML is what's called a markup language. So it's kind of a programming language, not really actually, it's a declarative language. And what an HTML page is simply text, but with these things called tags in them. And a typical web page will have this kind of structure. So at the beginning, you always have this so-called doc type declaration. That's a message to a web browser to say, hey, this is an HTML page. Then the structure is you have these two outer HTML tags, and then you nest other tags inside. So you have like a head for the head is for the top of a page, like metadata or the title of the page that appears in your browser. The body is where you actually put the content of the page. Okay, so this is how you can nest tags. A little thing here is, here's a couple of example tags. Like H1 stands for the biggest type of heading you have in an HTML page. And you have, that's how you do an opening tag. So it's got this, these triangular brackets. And then when you have a closing tag, it's basically the same as the opening tag, but it always has this slash in it right there. The other thing to be aware of is you also have something called attributes. And this is an example of a HTML link. So you have an opening triangular bracket. A stands for, I actually don't know what A stands for. But anyway, it's basically a link. So this is basically saying you have a link, and the target of the link is this reference, and it's the URL of the TX group. Oh, anchor. Yes, thank you, Omar. Exactly. A stands for anchor. The terminology actually nowadays is a bit outdated because I don't think really anyone talks about anchors anymore. But it was originally, the concept of HTML was to allow you to have a single page where you could have like a table of contents, and you could have these anchors in the content to link within the page. Anyway. So here we have an attribute, and the attribute has this form. So it has a name and then a value, and the value goes in quotes. So in this case, the value is a link. And so if a browser was to display this, you'd see that it says TX group underlined and probably in blue. And if you click on that word, it would take you to the TX group website. Okay, so that's like a quick intro to HTML. Anything confusing there so far?
All good.
Okay, so if you go to, there's a ton of places online where you could learn more about HTML. W3 Schools is a website that's not actually the most popular with everyone in the world, but with developers. But basically, they have a pretty complete and fairly friendly HTML tutorial, and they take you, the tags that I've shown you here, H1 and anchors. These are there's many more. So for example, that's a heading 1, that's down to a heading 6, and this is the markup for that. So they go through every type of tag that you have, and if you want to spend an hour, it's worth just kind of going through some of the tags. Like you'll find, where did I just see? There was you'll find all the tags listed here. Like for example, how you build a table that looks like this. So the purpose of HTML is to lay out pages and make documents that are visually appealing. You can do some things like making text bold, italic, and you have tags for all of these different things. So I'd recommend, if you wouldn't go wrong if you went to W3 Schools and looked at their HTML tutorial. Okay, let's put that out of the way. Okay, now in Google Apps Script, the way you create web apps is when you have a script, you go onto the Publish menu and you deploy it as a web app. And then this window comes up where it asks you a bunch of different options. So I'm going to just drop out of the presentation for a second and show you an example I've been putting together here. All right, so here we've got Google Apps Script. Let's just rename those for a second. But when you go to publish and deploy as web app, there's a few different things you can do here. So the first thing is that when you have deployed it, it will give you this URL. And this URL, you can just copy that into another window, and probably nothing's going to happen right now. Oh yeah, well, okay. You can copy that into another window and open it in another tab, and then you can access your web app. Every time you update your code, you need to use this thing to create a new version. So what happens is each version is remembered in the state of your code, but because the content is public and there might be someone using version 10, it allows you to keep that version alive if you need to go back to it. But every time you make an update to your code, you need to select new, and you could optionally put in a description here. Another thing is choosing who the code will execute as. So I usually leave it as myself, but you can have something. For example, if you wanted to have people using a web app that sends emails to people for some reason, and it should use their email address, that might be a case where you want to set it to execute as the user who's accessing the web app. That means if someone else opens this URL, instead of being logged in with your credentials, they'd be logged in with themselves, basically. Yeah, and finally, you can set what access there is to this app. So, and what this means is only myself, obviously only me, anyone within TX group, okay, so basically anyone with a TX group email address who's part of the G Suite login. Anyone means anyone with a Gmail account, and anyone even anonymous means you don't even need to be logged in anywhere to access the web app. Okay, so that's basically this thing to deploy as web app, and that's all. And the moment you get your first version, this URL becomes available, and then you can start accessing it. Now, let's go back to the presentation for a second. So to have a web app, you need to define one function. So this is a magic function. called doGet. And it has to be that name, and the syntax, the case needs to be exactly that. So do with a capital G get. And what this function does is it gets called when someone accesses the link that the web app's been published to. And then the function needs to return some outputs. And usually you use this thing called the HTML service to create some HTML output. So what we're doing here is we put some very simple HTML, just a heading. We pass that to this HTML service, say, okay, convert my heading into HTML output, and then I return it. There's a good guide here that explains all of this stuff in more detail if you want to get into that. But so here's the example that I had, first of all. So these ones we'll come to in a minute, but if that's what you just saw. So if I now create a new version, okay, so there's my doGet method, and I should copy the URL, access the URL on that page. So there you go. That's one-to-one the HTML that you can see here. So hello world, hello world. So far, so good?
Yes.
Okay, good,
Yes.
good. It's great. We're getting much more audible now. There's fewer of us. Okay, so that's that. Now, obviously, when you want to create a complex HTML document, just using tags like this, that's very tricky, and putting it in a string. So what's much easier is to use what's called HTML templates. And the way that works is basically like this. So you go into your whatever script you have, and you create a new file. Let me just expand that. So you say new HTML file, and you give it a name like example.html. And then in your doGet function, instead of calling this method create HTML output, you say create template from file, and there you use the name of the file. And the important thing is it's just the first part. You don't need to put the .html in. Then I can pass a variable into the template, and then you finally say template.evaluate, and you return that, and that gets displayed. Now, let me show you what the template looks like in this example. So actually, let's just rename that function. So we got doGet there now. So this is the code I just showed you. And then if I look at my example file, this is the HTML template. And what you can see here is that this part is basic HTML. This part is a special Google Apps script syntax markup, where what this is saying is whatever is in this variable my name, display it in this location. So what we're doing there is we're saying basically, the template, we just create a variable that is, that belongs to the template. So you can, this is something that maybe I've kind of skipped over, the fact that you can do this with objects in JavaScript. You can give objects any property you like. So what this is actually a property of this template object. And I'm assigning it the value Harry. And then here, inside the template, I can just access that variable directly. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, cool. Now, usually the reason for doing this is you want to pass some data in from somewhere. And also, it's generally when you're using templates, it's a good idea to keep the code in any code inside a template as simple as possible, so that its only purpose is just like display, like how to lay out data and similar. Yeah. So let's try that. See what that does. Again, I need to publish as a new version. Update here. Reload now. It says hello, Harry. Okay, so that's a basic HTML template. Now we're going to do something a bit more complicated. And in this one, so actually the spreadsheet that we've got here is a spreadsheet of Donald Trump's lawsuits. And this thing I actually got online. There's the actual data set, there's a CSV file, and yeah, so it's a public data set, and right now it's in the spreadsheet here. Now what I'm doing here is creating a new template. So now we've got a more complex template here, and we'll have a look at that in a second. But in this template, basically, first we get all the data out of the spreadsheet, put it in here. So this thing you've seen before in previous lessons. Then we're going to create a property called columns, and we're going to shift off the column headings, which is basically this row at the top here, and put that into that property. And then once you've shifted off the columns, anything else that's left, we're going to assign that directly to the rows. Then we evaluate the template. Now the template itself, here I'm doing something a little bit more complicated. So you can also embed JavaScript inside these templates. So this is basically a for loop again that we've seen. So we're saying we start with always you have the three conditions in a for loop, like a variable with a starting value, the limit, so the end condition, and then the increments, like how much it should change each time you go around the loop. So what we're saying here is with this special syntax, so less than question mark and question mark less than, this is a chunk of JavaScript that we've put inside the HTML. What happens is when we call template.evaluate, that JavaScript gets executed. And so what this is doing is it's putting the columns from the spreadsheet inside an HTML table. And I'll explain the HTML in a moment. And then down here, what I'm doing is then looping over each of the rows in the data, and for each row, I loop through the values. Okay, and so what this thing looks like, if I just update the code to activate that. Okay, so let's publish a new version. Okay, go back over here. Okay, and now what we've got is all the data from the spreadsheet being displayed in this web page. Actually, let me just increase the size of the window a little bit, and perhaps reduce the font size so you can see a bit more. So, so you've got all the values here. Now, I've done a few tricks in the template to make the data look more attractive. So the first thing is we're using, all right, so this is a more complex structure of a HTML page. So you've got the root HTML tag. You've got the head of the page. Here you've got the title that would appear in some browsers, and then you have these two things. And what I'm doing here is I'm including a third-party like JavaScript tool called data tables. You can find data tables described on datatables.net. And it's and this is one of the things that's interesting about web applications. So they publish the code on what's called their content delivery network. You'll find various information about that on their web page, like talking about the content delivery network and how you can use that. And what I've done here is included, basically I've linked in third-party code using these tags. So I can say I want to include a third-party JavaScript which comes from this URL. And if I, just to show you what that looks like, if I copy that and put it in a new browser, you can see this is a whole load of unreadable JavaScript, but it is JavaScript. And then on the other thing we have is the style sheet, a CSS style sheet. Again, that's on a third-party website. Now, what style sheets do, and we'll look at that maybe in another lesson, but a style sheet, or CSS, as it's called, cascading style sheets, is a way to to alter the look and feel of a web page without needing to change the HTML. So with a style sheet, you can do things like say, I want all my headings to be red. That's the sort of stuff you can do in style sheets. If you're already curious about style sheets, on W3 Schools, again, they have a CSS tutorial. And this is what CSS looks like. So CSS, you can think of it as kind of the best friend of HTML. So it's another language, and it complements HTML with the ability to like stylize a web page. So for example, this bit of CSS is saying, yeah, we're going to set the background color of the page to light blue. Any heading tag, any H1 tag should be white, and the text should be center aligned. And any P, which is a paragraph tag, should have this font family and that font size. So, and you can, on W3 Schools, you can test stuff for yourself. So this block of style is being displayed. You can see how it's displayed there. So I could change that to red. Now I've changed the color of the page. Now normally, you don't normally put, you can put CSS styles directly into a web page like this is doing. Normally you put CSS styles in a separate file on a separate URL. Yeah. Anyway, so just, we can look at CSS in some more detail another time. And so far we haven't gone even very deep into HTML. But the short version is that with these two lines, I'm loading this third-party tool or library called data tables, which allows you to make kind of attractive looking tables with various features on top of basic HTML tables. Okay, so we're adding that there. In the body of the HTML, we have to declare a table tag, and we give it an ID so that we can tell this data tables tool which table it should customize. Then in a table, you always have two parts, a table heading and a table body. And inside the table head, you put the column headings, and the column headings have to live inside a row, which is a TR. So TR stands for table row, and then TH stands for table heading. And then in the body of the table, you have a table row, and then TD stands for table data. These are basically cells of the table. So that's how we've declared the table. Then we need to tell data table, this tool here, to initialize and apply itself to the Trump lawsuits table. That ID corresponds to this thing here, basically. So, and what we end up with is basically this thing. So this is all the data from the spreadsheet, but now we have things like a pager. So at the moment, it's just showing 10 rows at a time. You can also search for it. So if I search for, say, Kim, to anything involving Trump universities. So if I start searching for university, it just shows me a couple of these rows. And then you can also do stuff like sorting and that kind of stuff. And all of this functionality you get for free. And this is once you get into this stuff and see, like in JavaScript, there are so many libraries for everything. You remember the Wheel of Fortune that I did before? I could show you that again now quickly. So it's still a little bit slow to load. Sorry about that. All right, there we go. And so if I go into the script editor of the Wheel of Fortune, this is a simple web app. If you remember, it looked like this. So we could spin this wheel. And all of that logic, I didn't really write any of that. So I just use this do-get function to process this template. I have to pass in some data into the template. That's what the rest of that's doing. And then all the rest of this stuff was some code I found online, plus this JavaScript like visualization library called Convert for doing two-dimensional art, basically. So yeah, and you see a bunch of examples. So and there are endless JavaScript libraries for anything you can imagine. And once you get a bit of experience with this, you find pretty much any kind of cool visual effect you want to build, you'll find examples and libraries already on the internet for that. Another good example is Carol's word cloud that he's been doing for the micro-mentoring app. So as we said last time, this is all Google Apps Script. There's a spreadsheet behind the scenes here, and it builds this word cloud. And if we do like, if I just search for JavaScript word cloud, you find, I think, yeah, a bunch of different examples. And most of these things, they explain relatively easily how you set that up. So here's a example of, I think this is probably the library he used to do that word cloud. So it means, in other words, things that would take a long time for someone to write the whole thing from scratch can be done very, very quickly and easily. Yeah. So that's HTML templates. Yeah. Actually, that's what I have for this week. Any questions on what you've seen so far? That's the short version of how web apps work. And maybe actually one other thing. There are various libraries for doing all kinds of cool visualizations. Like D3 is a famous one. So you can, or this InfoVis. So you can, with this, you can do stuff like this cloud for visualizing data, or you can have, if you wanted to show like a network of connections, this could be like customers and salespeople and how they're related, or I don't know, whatever this is. It's kind of an org charty type of visualization. And this can be super useful for exploring data in a way that makes it easier to understand. And again, these things, you know, with not much work, you can get to a point where you can embed this in Google Apps Script. Yeah, let me hand over. Any questions so far? Is that fairly clear?
I have one question.
Yes.
So you've been showing us that we can visualize and show data, for instance, also coming from a sheet, from a spreadsheet. Can we see maybe an example where you do this the other way around? For instance, you have a form and you input some information.
Yeah. Now, the short version is the normal way to do this with a simple web server, where you do a get and a post. That's kind of the old school way of doing this. Doesn't really work on Google Apps Script because they have like a security sandbox that prevents it. I don't have the example properly prepared for you right now, but there are there's different ways you can do it. So one is you can do this thing where, like, say you have a form in a web page, there's a special function for executing server-side JavaScript on the client side. So you can basically say, when this form is submitted, run that code on the server and return me the result. I hope, so I'm going to look, I was going to do this today, but then given that we're explaining HTML and this kind of stuff, it seemed like too much all at once, but I'm planning to go into that later. Also, Ajax, so a lot of these like single page frameworks are using Ajax, and that works pretty well. You also have like this URL fetch method where you can do stuff with that too. So let me bring that to you for the next lesson, and because yeah, I think otherwise it would have been too much for this lesson, because it's a little bit, that part is a little bit tricky on Google Apps Script. It's not as friendly maybe as normal web development. If you want, I can let me see if I can find this example that I had before. I think this is the one. Yeah, so this answer basically explains it. So, but on the in client side JavaScript. So for the rest of you guys, I'm going to come back and explain this. So I'm putting it in terms I think Omar will immediately get. But in client-side JavaScript, when you have a Google app script, you can have this Google script run, and that allows you to call a function on the server side. So what you do there, they're probably, this is probably a full example here. So you can't submit a form normally, but this is a web page with a form. So forms in HTML allow you to send data to a server. And the way you do that then is you kind of have to prevent the normal form submission. That's what this is doing here. And then when they click submit on the form, the handling of that is handled by this method, and this is still client side, but it says run this function on the server, this process form function on the server with the form data. So the process form function looks like this. So that's the server-side code. That's the client-side code. So I can put that on, let me put it on the Slack channel. And I'll put that in the classroom notes as well. So we'll go into that in some more detail later, and then show how you could build simple UIs and this kind of stuff. What I was planning to use for later lessons, now this is not a CSS framework that many people will use normally. But given that we're using Google Apps Script and the spreadsheets, when you use this CSS framework and you add like additional menus to Google Sheets, then you'll get things that look kind of at home. So you got these kind of buttons.
I cannot see the screen. Is that on purpose or?
Oh, sorry. Did I stop sharing? Oh, Jesus. I was just testing that who's awake.
Good one.
So, okay, so you missed the whole thing, Omar. But on this page, this is a link I shared. They give you a complete example of how you do form processing, and it relies on this special client-side function, Google script run, and that runs a server-side function to handle the form. Okay, that was that. What I was thinking of using for later examples would be materialize.css, which is a material design CSS framework. And if you build forms and UIs using this, you end up with things that look kind of at home when you're like adding, say, UI to a Google Sheet. There are other frameworks. So CSS Framework is basically a stylized collection of buttons and UI components that you can build user interfaces with without having to do everything from scratch. And probably the most famous one is called Bootstrap. And this might be one you want to look at in general. because this has lots of different things. So and is very well known. So let's just see if components. That's what I'm looking for. So you can build whole user interfaces out of all these different, like buttons, for example. So with this, you get different buttons. For the Hack Days thing I was doing, which is in here, basically. So I think I showed you this in a previous lesson. Let's get the script editor up. So this is another web app, which looks like this. And you'll see it has this, excuse me, this weird kind of old school retro style. And that was done with this NES CSS framework, which is a bit slow to load right now. Ruining the whole, okay, yeah, so with this CSS framework, again, for hardly any work, you get all these user interface components that you can just add to your page. You can see almost exactly, and these boxes, for example, and the positioning of the titles here, and this button, this is all stuff that's coming from just adding this framework. So it's incredibly quick to do, basically. Like for me, building this thing was probably less than 30 minutes. Yeah. Cool. So actually, let me, as a homework for this time, also as quite a lot of people are on holiday or away today, I'd suggest we just keep to a fairly simple one, which is simply create a script that says "Hello World" and contains a link to tx.group. So you can do that either by just creating a spreadsheet and then going into the script editor, or just go straight to script.google.com and create a new project called web app. Yeah. Cool. Any more questions for today? Was that in some ways enlightening of what's possible? Sorry,
there is a question in the chat.
Oh, did I change the URL of the web app? No, that's a good question actually. So when you publish a URL, maybe if you change the access permissions, then the URL changes. But basically, the link that they give you, which I'll put on the chat, if I can find it again. I have too many windows open. So this is the type of link that you get, and that stays the same even as you publish new versions. Yeah. Was it?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Can you change this into making this something much more intuitive, like saying hackdays.something else? Or is it something you wouldn't be doing with Google App? Then you would go a different way if you wanted to create a standalone website that way?
So Google doesn't support that, and I think the reason is that if people want to do that kind of thing, they actually want you to go on to some of their onto the Google Cloud and do it that way. There are some simple things you could do. So, for example, there is the iframe element. So if I share my screen again, all right, so let's say this is iframe tag in HTML is the first thing. And if we go in here, so what an iframe does is it embeds another web page in the current page. So now what I could do is if I take, for example, this Hack Days page and put that in here and run, it's probably not going to look very good. Oh, okay. They don't even allow iframes. Yeah. Honestly, I've actually never done it this way. So most of these things that I've been publishing this way, I'm not trying to do genuinely public-facing websites, and so it's more for like utilities and stuff that you might share within a team. Yeah, I mean the other approaches you have, you can also like if you were building a proper website, there are the Google Cloud API tools so that you can extract data, say, from a spreadsheet and use a different programming language completely to generate a website from it. But yeah, the short version is these links are not really, there isn't a way to change this. The only thing that that Carol did is basically this, which is using a URL shortener. So that the link I just posted is points to, so that's a friendlier way to share those links. Bitly is free to use for the basic features. So you can just have a link like that, which redirects to a script. Yeah, I know it's not really perfect, but I think Google does it strategically because this scripting platform is not really designed for public-facing web servers, and if they made it any friendlier in terms of the URLs, you'd have basically the internet would be, developers all over the internet would be kind of abusing it for different purposes. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any more questions?
No, not for now.
I hope, Omar, that was also, you could get something out of that at the end. So, yeah. And also, I'd be interested here if you like, I was thinking of going with this materialize framework, but if you have a better idea, Omar, I mean, the other option is probably Bootstrap, because there's a lot of tutorials about that.
I usually use materialize.
Oh, okay, perfect. Oh, okay, then you're the materialize expert. That's fantastic.
Well,
so just maybe just to mention that point briefly. So, and we'll get into that. We'll get into that in a later lesson. But basically, material design is a design language that Google developed. Oops, material design. and it's a set of rules for how you design web pages or user interfaces. It was originally intended for mobile development, and it has various metaphors that basically, the idea is it's this metaphor that you have like pieces of paper that can be seen to be sitting on top of each other. But the whole advantage of using a design framework like this is it saves you a lot of time in the design process, because this design's been tested on a lot of users and has been shown to work pretty well. And it's basically in like Google Sheets, this is basically material design, like all this user interface. That button up there, for example, is a classic material design button. So using this materialized CSS framework, if you then add your own menus to a spreadsheet, then they're going to look sort of familiar to users, like they belong there. Yeah. Okay. So thanks a lot. It's a reduced set of people as it's holiday time. Yeah, I'll stop the recording and wish you guys lots